Fifth Third Bank and by the support of these donors.
At Fifth Third, we believe when diverse voices are heard and empowered, communities are made stronger, lives are made better, and the future holds greater promise for all. That's why we're proud to support Chicago Tonight Black Voices. Together, we can make a difference. Together, we can drive change.
Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight Black Voices. I'm Brandis Friedman. Thank you for sharing part of your weekend with us. On the show tonight, a new mental health initiative led by young men of color. Why organizers say listening to those impacted by trauma is key to improving mental wellness. One man's fight for justice is chronicled in a film about marijuana criminalization, produced by a Chicago cannabis company. A Southside emergency room serves as the backdrop to a larger conversation on the U.S. healthcare system. The author of The Emergency joins us to discuss healthcare inequities and challenges in the ER. And a rare Chicago showing of provocative paintings by an overlooked artist at the Chicago Cultural Center. First off tonight, a group of young people are leading an effort to rethink how to approach mental health for young men of color. In collaboration with Lurie Children's Hospital, young researchers with the racial justice organization Communities United conducted a study focused on the mental health and well-being of Black and brown young men in Chicago. The report, titled Changing the Beat of Mental Health, identifies mental health challenges and makes recommendations about how to cope. Joining us now with more are Renee Walker, Senior Director of Community Health Initiatives and Program Development for the Patrick Magoon Institute for Healthy Communities at Lurie Children's Hospital, and Jamal Ray, a youth researcher for the study. Thank you to you both for joining us. Jamal, let's start with you first. Please briefly give us a description of some of the key findings of this report, and what was it that stuck out to you the most?
A couple key findings were young boys and men of color saw deep connections between systemic inequities and mental health, and also that they often internalized the blame for it, as well as trauma is often normalized, and young men of color want to be seen for their full identities and leadership potential.
And I want to come back to that concept of normalizing trauma in just a little bit. But before we do, Jamal, 66% of the young men surveyed reported facing challenges with their mental health. Were you surprised by that at all?
No, I would not. I was not surprised by that at all, for the simple reason that we come across challenges every day, and life itself is hard on a lot of young men in general, but mostly young men of color.
Renee Walker, why was it important for the youth themselves to lead this research?
Well, one thing is that in order to transform systems, we must ensure that the voices and perspectives of young people is central to the conversation. And I know from at a pediatric hospital, the youth voice is central to the programs that we have. They inform our programs, our policies, and in order for us to really have kind of the lasting impact that we want to have with working with communities, it's really important that the youth voice is elevated and prioritized.
Now, Renee, 55% of young men of color say that they would consider professional counseling if they were offered the opportunity. What does that say to you about the accessibility of mental health services?
Well, I think with that particular finding in particular, the question is, well, is the glass half full or half empty? And in the report, the young men, there's some that spoke about distrust in systems. They spoke of experiences with systemic racism. And then on the other hand, you have young men who talked about the importance of training mental health professionals from the community. That is, those that have similar backgrounds, those that have similar lived experiences. So what that tells me is that giving certain circumstances where they can feel safe, that young men are willing to seek professional care.
Jamal, this report, as we said, it also dug into the normalization of trauma for Black and brown young men. Give us a description of what that is and talk a little bit about its presence in communities of color.
So if anyone has visited a community of color, they would know that The name just coming into a West Side area is often basically known as trouble or violence, and that's the trauma that is implemented in those communities. So like the trauma is being around the violence so much, and also that it is normal to know that someone is being shot or someone is being killed, and making that normal is basically something that we do not want to continue to have in our communities.
Jamal, what kind of support do you think would help Black and brown young men to heal or address some of this trauma?
Most definitely, it would be recreational facilities, and just changing the way our neighborhoods are looked upon. So basically, like transforming those bad aspects into positivity and bringing light to the things that we can do to change how young men of color experience that young men of color have and why we have them.
Renee, on that note, what are some of the effects of normalized or unaddressed trauma, and how can that impact someone's well-being?
One of the dangers to normalizing trauma is that one begins to become desensitized to traumatic events. And for communities of color in particular, where there's distrust in systems, the tendency is to deal with the trauma oneself. And that can be detrimental because we know that untreated trauma can lead to, or can have lasting impacts, negative impacts on behavior, on academic performance, and on brain development.
Jamal, this study had also looked at systemic inequities and their impact on mental health. Young men who took the survey identified issues like education, jobs, racism, and poverty as contributing to mental health. How can some of these outside factors like school or work or the prevalence of violence in the community contribute to some of those mental health challenges?
So one thing is the violence creates trauma, and also a symptom called PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorders. And that comes from having or being around and experiencing so much that involves violence or death. And that can even be just having the instability of a home. Also with schools, it can come from like trusting counselors and then being betrayed by them, as such as being put into the system, which that's not the way that young men of color want to be put into. We just want to be heard and also supported the best way possible.
One of the recommendations presented in the report is to, quote, create targeted goals for bringing more mental health professionals into the system who are people of color. Renee, how can the healthcare community, how can the system accomplish that?
Well, we love the recommendations that came from the report. And one of the things that we recommend is having pipeline programs for young people of color, again, with the lived experiences that the young men identified in the report. So pipeline programs where they can get involved in becoming a mental health professional. And at Lurie Children's, we certainly have the infrastructure and the experience, over 20 years of experience in creating and offering pipeline programs.
And Renee, what are the next steps then, briefly? How is Lurie Children's Hospital supporting the research and potentially moving it forward?
Great. So one of the things we're continuing to prioritize and elevate youth voice, which is something we've done even prior to the Ujima Project. But we'll continue to work with Communities United in identifying actionable next steps and making sure that young people are very much crucial and centered to the process.
Okay, and that's where we'll have to leave it. Best of luck to you both in your work. Thanks for joining us, Jamal Ray and Renee Walker.
Thank you.
And we're back with more Chicago Tonight Black Voices right after this. The war on drugs led to the incarceration of thousands of black men during the 80s and 90s. Nonviolent drug offenders were sometimes sentenced to decades in prison for buying and selling marijuana. A Chicago-based cannabis company is now working to expose harsh sentences for recreational marijuana use as it becomes legal in more and more states. Cresco helped produce a short film on the sentencing of Michael Thompson, a Michigan man who was given 42 to 60 years in prison for a marijuana-related arrest.
Thompson is considered the longest incarcerated non-violent offender in Michigan's history.
The parole board has an opportunity to send his case to Governor Whitmer for clemency.
I want to say a prayer for him, because this is his last try. If they don't let him go this time, it's over.
In parole boards in other states, people answer the phone, you can talk to members of the board, you can talk to their secretaries. It's just bizarre to me that no one's responsive to us.
It makes me mad as hell. My father's sitting behind the bars for marijuana. Everybody around Michigan, freely smoking.
Michael Thompson was convicted in 1994 for selling 3 pounds of pot to a close friend turned police informant. That arrest led to a search of his home where police found weapons. Even though the weapons were not used in the marijuana sale, Thompson was sentenced on firearm possession charges and drug charges. He was granted clemency and released from prison in January of last year, 3 years after Michigan legalized recreational marijuana. A short film documenting his story premiered earlier in March at the South by Southwest Film Festival in Texas.
I got reached out to by the nonprofit, The Last Prisoner Project. And when I learned about their mission and some of the stories and constituents that they work with, I felt like that, it'd be a great partnership to see if I can kind of help. And when I learned about Michael's story and started speaking to him, I felt like there was a connection there. He's not only is his story obviously a gross injustice, but I also felt like he wanted to tell his story, and I felt like he was, this charismatic guy that's but also very vulnerable, and we had these very emotional phone calls that I feel like I could help get his story out there.
That's my mission. It feels real good for other people could see the pain that I endured. And so I'm thankful to Kyle and the whole team for putting it out there for other people to see. And maybe they can feel what I feel, which was a lot of pain. And I want them to see Department of Correction for what Department of Corrections really is, and what it really does to a family. And it tears a family apart.
Thompson spent a total of 26 years behind bars. Up next, the latest installment in our Black Voices book club right after this. The list of injuries and illnesses that present themselves in a Chicago South Side emergency department is endless, from gunshot wounds to drug overdoses to young people having a stroke as a complication of COVID-19. There's been no doubt of the health inequities illuminated by the pandemic, as the COVID tracking project points to a death rate 1.4 times higher for Black people than white people. Those inequities and how healthcare systems contribute to them are the focus of the latest selection in our Black Voices Book Club series. The Emergency, a year of healing and heartbreak in a Chicago ER, was written by Dr. Thomas Fisher, an emergency medicine physician at the University of Chicago Medical Center. And Dr. Fisher joins us now. Thank you for joining us and welcome to Chicago Tonight, Black Voices. First, briefly describe for me what this book is about, please.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be able to talk to you and your community. I wrote this book as a summation of 20 years of practice on the South Side of Chicago, where I've seen everything from, the ongoing pandemic to the pandemic of gun violence and mental illness. And what I wanted to do was lay bare to my patients the challenges that they face are not simply their own, but are part of a larger system that structures our society and structures our healthcare system. And in the process, help them understand that we as providers are right there with them and trying to see them for the people that they are and the challenges that they face, but also to step back and illuminate these larger structures to help them understand what it is that influences their health and ultimately their healthcare as well.
Now, the book mostly takes us through your experience as an ER physician throughout 2020, the start of the pandemic, of course. How did the pandemic expose and exacerbate some of the healthcare challenges that you face every day?
I remember starting the book before the pandemic, talking about overwhelmed emergency departments and the challenges of everyday people facing one of the days that they'll never forget, whether it's their car accident or a stroke. And then all of a sudden, society shut down. I don't know if you remember back in March of 2020, when we watched the pandemic coming from Asia slowly march its way across Europe, with Italy being overwhelmed, and then soon it struck New York and Seattle. In those times, we were bracing ourselves in the emergency department, girding for what we knew would be an overwhelmed population of folks who were ill coming to us. And we also knew that for the first time, we were also a part of the illness equation. Working with teams of nurses and physician colleagues and respiratory therapists and techs, we're used to making high stakes decisions, but we're not used to being the ones that might also fall ill, might also not go home. Over the course of the pandemic, we saw communities fall sick, multi-generational families, full of folks who were deemed essential workers, who were delivering our food and stocking our shelves. Were being exposed to the virus in ways that folks who were able to work at home in front of a screen just simply were not. It was more tangible and real in some communities than others. And as a result, we saw these vast differences in mortality that you described earlier.
You dedicate this book to your patients, and you talk about wanting them to know that the problems they are experiencing are part of a bigger problem. From your perspective, what does the healthcare system, or down to the hospital ER level, what do we need to be doing differently?
I think the first step is to see honestly what's going on. The best part about being an emergency medicine physician is this intimacy of strangers. People come to me and tell me stories that are secrets that they hold from those closest to them. And they share them because they want to get better, that they know something is going wrong and they want help. They share not only these secrets about themselves, but they expose themselves fully personally and even allow me to touch them where it hurts, and take care of them in ways that reveal a humanity that's stripped free of their title and their status in society. Whether wealthy or poor, everybody wants exactly the same thing. They want to be cared for when they're hurt. They want their mother to be taken care for carefully. They want their children to be healed. That shared humanity is something that we need to respect as a society, and no more importantly than where we get our healthcare. If we have a society that is stratified by racial caste, where whites are above blacks across society in our segregation and our allocation of resources. And we have an unchecked capitalism that creates winners and losers. When it comes to our health, who should be chosen to lose? I argue in this book that nobody can lose, that we're all human, equally worthy and important. And when we structure a healthcare system, we can't fall prey to these old patterns. We have to think differently, and we need radical transformation to do that.
You also write letters to your patients, colleagues, your mom. Why write a letter? What did you want those folks to hear from you?
Well, it took me 20 years to figure out what it is that I'm seeing. There are patterns that come in the emergency department. I see young Black folks with chronic illness before their time. I see young people getting shot doing everyday activities. I see the mentally ill languishing for hours, being unable to find a bed. People who have simple injuries, finding it impossible to find follow-up care. These complicated systems require that there's a depth of understanding that is very hard to transmit unless you're doing it very personally and simply. And so what I wanted to do was identify an individual who is subject to some of these larger social ills and explain to them directly, here's why this is happening to you. You think it's just you and me, or maybe it's just you think it's bad luck that happened in your life. But in fact, it's bigger than that. It's bigger than your community in this medical center. And in fact, it's as big as society. And I wanted to reveal that to my patients through this book. And the most simple way to do that is to simply pretend as though I was writing them a letter and just explain it directly to them as though we had more time and I could actually talk to them one-on-one.
You write a lot, of course, about feeling trapped in a system that doesn't always give high quality care to everyone. One quote that stands out for us was, quote, "That gap between what we need to do for truly sick people and what we can do because of resource constraints is one of the deepest frustrations I face." We've got about a minute left, Dr. Fisher. Tell me a little bit about those frustrations and how you manage them yourself.
Imagine you're facing a full waiting room where you see 5 people who are critically ill, but you only have 2 beds in which to place them. And it's your decision who goes where. That sort of moral conflict is overwhelming. And to face that day after day, year after year, knowing that there isn't going to be change, requires a sort of clarity in understanding and facing what it is that we're challenged with. That moral conflict is one that happens in emergency departments across the city and across the nation. And as I talk to peers, they all feel similarly. We need to do better for our patients.
Okay. Dr. Thomas Fisher, thanks for the work that you do in this time and for finding a few minutes to spend with us. Congrats on the book, and thank you for joining us.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me on.
Again, the book is called The Emergency, A Year of Healing and Heartbreak in a Chicago ER. You can read an excerpt on our website. An art exhibition at the Chicago Cultural Center comes with an advisory. Along with mature content and nudity, some of the paintings use stereotypes to critique racism and sexism in American culture. So fair warning, the artist Robert Colescott didn't pull any punches. Producer Mark Vitale has the story.
The colorful canvases challenge expectations. A painting from 1980 shows Shirley Temple and Bill Bojangles Robinson with their races reversed. The images reveal and provoke and resist easy answers. We spoke with the curator from her home in Baltimore. She told us about the first time she saw Robert Colescott's paintings in the 1970s.
I looked at them and I kind of went, oh my God. The impact of them was so immediate because I really saw the mischievousness of the paintings and really related to it. To walk in and see these paintings that were so naughty and satirical and humorous, but at the same time smacking you around, was probably one of the most revelatory moments of my life.
An autobiographical painting depicts Colescott's parents' move from New Orleans to California. Colescott was a veteran of World War II and well-traveled. He studied with Fernand Léger in France in the 1950s and spent much of the 60s in Egypt. He was the first African-American artist to represent the United States at the Venice Biennale. The curator was a friend of the artist.
Bob was probably one of the most literate artists that I knew in terms of what history is about, but had this unique ability to translate that knowledge into images that were very impactful. A lot of times there are visual puns that you have to sort of really be attuned to. Titles like Colored TV are a play on, both the fact of the colorization of images on TV, but also the lack of representation of Black people.
The late artist made news earlier this year when the Lucas Museum paid $15 million for a canvas that features George Washington Carver crossing the Delaware. That painting isn't in the show, but an early sketch of it is. Before his death in 2009, Colescott had influenced a younger generation of political artists. His own influences were numerous.
Colescott was very interested in popular illustration, the comics, cartoons, Hollywood movies, advertising, the kind of bombardment of images that we experience in culture. He is addressing you in a way that's, filled with irony.
And you sort of recognize certain elements, so that might make you laugh, but then you have to sort of figure out, what are you laughing at?
The Chicago Cultural Center is as busy as it's been in 2 years, with Chris Ware's comic book exhibition, galleries dedicated to the underground magazine Lumpin' on its 30th anniversary, and Hi Buddy, a shop that showcases local artists and small manufacturers. Joining these exhibitions is this rare retrospective of the work of Robert Colescott. We asked the curator about the best way to approach the paintings.
I just encourage people to sort of look carefully, resist immediate reactions, try to come to some comprehension of what you're reacting to, if it's, more on the negative side, and sort of see if it's warranted and sort of see if there's not something that you can relate to in what he's trying to tell you in his paintings.
For Chicago Tonight, this is Mark Vitale.
The exhibition is called Art and Race Matters, the career of Robert Colescott. It is free at the Cultural Center and runs through May 29th. And you heard Mark mention Chris Ware's comic book exhibition and the galleries dedicated to the underground magazine Lumpen. Those exhibitions have ended since the story first aired. More details on our website. And that's our show for this weekend. Be sure to check out our website, WTTW.com/news, for the very latest from WTTW News. And if you're watching us on Saturday night, know that you can also catch Black Voices and Latino Voices on Sundays beginning at 10 p.m. And join me and Paris Schutz next week at 7 on Chicago Tonight. And join me Monday night at 8 p.m. for our next virtual community conversation. We'll talk about the state of voting rights in the country. To RSVP, just visit WTTW.com/events. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight Black Voices, I'm Brandis Friedman. Thank you for sharing part of your weekend with us. Stay healthy and safe, and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a personal injury law firm dedicated to preserving the dignity and rights of all individuals.